Hello, learners, and welcome to the 34th lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. We have been discussing the work of W.H. Auden. In particular, we have been pursuing the exact intellectual, literary, and cultural contexts for an appropriate, adequate, and thorough understanding of the iconic poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats. I have been discussing Auden's own career, his political affiliations, his commitment to socialism, his politics, as well as his complicated dialogue with the literary tradition, especially the figures of other poets such as W.B. Yeats and Wilfred Owen. I will continue that process and hopefully culminate in a discussion of the poem itself. So I mentioned that there are some prose pieces that Auden had written which help us understand the particular power of the poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats. I described that in the year that Yeats passed away, Auden wrote an essay titled The Public versus the Late Mr. William Butler Yeats. In this essay, Auden spoke from two perspectives. One perspective was titled that of the public prosecutor, and the second perspective was that of the counsel for the defense. Now, this is a very strange way to commemorate the death of a very powerful, popular, beloved, respected poet. If one poet is writing an essay remembering the life and work of another poet, why would they divide their opinions into two categories? The first category, the public prosecutor, presents all the reasons why Yeats must be disliked or must be criticized as a poet. The second perspective, the counsel for the defense, does quite literally what it claims. It defends the figure of William Butler Yeats. This gives us a clue to how Auden works as a poet and as an elegist. As an elegist, Auden gives voice to feelings of deep pathos, feelings of genuine grief and loss. But these feelings of pathos, grief, and loss do not suppress the skeptical intelligence with which Auden channels the sharp awareness of the life of his subject. So Auden can create room for both of these contradictory things. On one hand, the feelings of utter loss and grief. On the other hand, thoughts of intelligence and skepticism, which do not forget all of the wrong things or bad things that the subject of his elegy was associated with. The essay that Auden published the next year, a review of Yeats's late poems and plays. In that essay, Auden quite explicitly mentioned that many of Yeats's beliefs were similar to those of the beliefs of the fascists of the time. The fascists were individuals like Hitler and Mussolini. And this was, in fact, the strongest evidence or strongest possible reason for why Yeats was disliked, along with Eliot and Pound, as I've mentioned before. Auden could write about Yeats's disagreeable politics, while at the same time writing about Yeats's very powerful poems. And it's the combination of both of these things which gives Auden's poem about Yeats its unique and poignant power. The final prose piece by Auden, which I mentioned as giving an important context to the poem In Memory of W.B. Yeats, is the essay Yeats as an Example from the year 1948. In this essay, I will read from a quote from this essay to help clarify the particular way in which Auden drew inspiration. Auden writes, Yeats transformed a certain kind of poem, the occasional poem, from being either an official performance of impersonal virtuosity or a trivial poem into a serious reflective poem of at once personal and public interest. Further, a poem such as In Memory of Major Robert Gregory is something new and important in the history of English poetry. It never loses the personal note of a man speaking about his personal friends in a particular setting. In Adonis, for instance, both Shelley and Keats disappear as people. And at the same time, the occasion and the characters acquire a symbolic public significance. So, what is this unique strength that Auden identifies in the poem titled In Memory of Major Robert Gregory? The strength of this poem by Yeats, which Auden identifies, is the strength that Auden will demonstrate most powerfully in his own poem, which will be titled almost as a repetition of this poem, In Memory of W.B. Yeats. That quality is the combination of two things. On one hand, the poet must preserve a sense of talking about the subject of his elegy as a real human being. And Auden gives the example of famous elegies from the Romantic era, that is, Adonis by Shelley and Keats. In this poem, Auden argues, we are given the praise of a person as a highly virtuous, idealistic, beautiful soul, wonderful person, and superlative praises fail to describe the person as a real human being. A real human being has flaws, and a real human being is identified by certain small details of their existence. These details happen to be missing from many elegies. Yeats, who was inspired by poems from the Romantic era, managed to preserve some of these details. So his elegy was always about one person remembering a close friend. It was never a universal or generic praise. This was the first thing. This was combined with the second thing, which was a powerful sense that while writing about a friend or an ordinary human being, the poet was also making a statement about a larger public event or a series of historical events or a historical tendency. So both of these senses coexist at the same time, and this, for Auden, in the year 1948, was Yeats's achievement as a poet who wrote elegies. The elegies that Yeats wrote were about individual people, but they also placed these individuals in larger historical trends. There was a historical and social force which was by definition much larger than any individual. It was by definition made up of an aggregate of individuals. And both of these senses, the individual as well as the historical trend, which was much greater than the individual, both these senses coexist in Yeats's poems. So with these descriptions, we are now well placed to try and appreciate what that sense is. And we will do that first by reading very briefly a couple of poems by William Butler Yeats. The first poem by Yeats that I will read to help convey the sense that Auden has so usefully identified for us is a poem titled September 1913. This is what Yeats writes in this poem. What need you, being come to sense, but fumble in a greasy till, and add the halfpence to the pence, and prayer to shivering prayer, until you have dried the marrow from the bone? For men were born to pray and save, romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave. Now, the last line of this stanza uh, gives us the strongest possible clue that this poem is in fact an elegy. Or even if it is not intended primarily as an elegy, it must be read and understood as an elegy. It's an elegy for John O'Leary, a campaigner, an activist, a scholar, and a brave soul who gave his life fighting for the cause of Irish nationalism and Irish political independence. The death of John O'Leary affected Yeats in a very powerful way. This was a moment that produced a kind of political transformation, a transformation in Yeats's consciousness of himself as a poet, as an individual living and writing in a particular time in history. Yeats became conscious of himself as an Irish poet, writing at a time when other Irish people were giving up their lives for the sake of Irish nationalism. Yeats's response to that was to turn with a great deal of pity and pathos toward individuals who had given up their lives. Yeats did not turn nationalist in his political views. Yeats remained indifferent. Yeats remained conservative. Yeats did not join politics. In fact, Yeats remained an aristocrat. But in the way that Yeats wrote poems, he turned his gaze inward, and his gaze became more sensitive. His gaze became more attentive to the suffering in the lives of people other than himself. The next stanza goes, "Yet they were of a different kind, the names that stilled your childish play. They have gone about the world like wind, but little time had they to pray, for whom the hangman's rope was spun, and what, God help us, could they save? Romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave." So this refrain, these two lines keep getting repeated. Romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave. So these two lines convey exactly what Auden described as Yeats's signal achievement. These two lines do both of those things. They tell us very clearly that the poet is inspired by the grief and loss that he's experiencing after the death of John O'Leary. However, the poet is not confined to his memories of one person. In fact, it is the memories of this one person which reminds the poet and educates the poet in a larger cultural and social history. What is that history? It is the history of the death of romantic Ireland. What does it mean, the death of romantic Ireland? It means that there was a time when nationalism meant something. There was a time when people who believed in nationalism could give up their lives and others could be inspired to join them, follow in their wake. The connection between one person's beliefs, their sacrificial actions, their sacrifice of their own bodies and their lives, and other people's inspiration by them. All of these things were organically connected. That time is no longer this time. This time has changed. The time that Yeats finds himself living in and through. In those times, Yeats argues that nationalism has become a corrupt and somewhat mechanical task. It is not romantic anymore. It is a highly mechanical task. It is governed by not deep moral beliefs. It is governed by selfish, materialist, political concerns. So this is how Yeats connects the death of his friend, a person he knew, the grief that he experiences at learning of the death of his friend, to his own political beliefs about the legitimacy or otherwise of nationalism. Further, this is how the poem goes. "Was it for this the wild geese spread the grey wing upon every tide? For this that all that blood was shed? For this Edward Fitzgerald died, and Robert Emmet and Wolfe Tone, all that delirium of the brave?" These three are revolutionary Irish freedom fighters: Edward Fitzgerald, Robert Emmet, and Wolfe Tone. Again, the same line, romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave. Yet could we turn the years again and call those exiles as they were, in all their loneliness and pain, you'd cry, some woman's yellow hair has maddened every mother's son. They weighed so lightly what they gave, but let them be, they're dead and gone, they're with O'Leary in the grave. So the same refrain continues and the same message is reinforced in a lot many words. The interesting thing to note about this poem is that while it is quite iconic and several writers, including Auden, will imitate it in their own way, the specific poem of Auden, which can be read as having been written as a homage to this poem, as well as a sort of inspiration, as inspired by this poem, is September 1, 1939. The interesting thing to note about this poem is that even though it was very, very iconic and very, very inspirational for several later poets in the 20th century, Yeats himself, in his own artistic maturity and having evolved further, considered this poem not among his best and actually very far from his best. Yeats considered this poem to be somewhat old-fashioned, repetitive, and overwritten. The poem that Yeats approved and having written which, Yeats found this poem to be less competent was in fact Easter 1916. Easter 1916 is a poem which defines the 20th century and which defines Yeats. So it's worth reading this poem a little bit to understand exactly what will be different and how Auden will learn from this poem to write an elegy of his own. So this is how Easter 1916 goes. I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among grey 18th century houses. I have passed with a nod of the head or polite meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite meaningless words, and thought before I had gone of a mocking tale or jibe to please a companion around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but lived where motley is born. All changed, changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. So these lines have become iconic. A terrible beauty is born has entered the English language, much like phrases from Shakespeare's play Hamlet, to be or not to be. This first stanza situates the poet's position in an urban setting. He says, I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces. Right? So the poet describes walking around in a city, that's Dublin, encountering people, workers, having finished their work and have headed home. These workers produce in the poet a recollection of common ties. The poet recalls that he's Irish, they are Irish. They both recognize the past, that is, they're both from rural Ireland. And the poet has a thought of talking about these people with another group of his, that is, to make a tale of this, to please a companion around the fire at the club. That is, later on, when he meets some of his more educated, more cultured friends at the club, he would tell these friends a story about the poor, working class, humble people he encountered while walking on the streets of Dublin. So Yeats is trying to pay attention to ordinary people, trying to be mindful of the fact that these ordinary people have a great deal of reality that they have witnessed. And Yeats, as a poet, must be humble enough to learn from them, to recognize these truths, and to put them into words. He then describes these people that he met. That woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument until her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers when, young and beautiful, she rode to harriers? This man had kept a school and rode our winged horse. This other, his helper and friend, was coming into his force. He might have won fame in the end, so sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought, this other man I had dreamed. A drunken, vainglorious lout. He had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart. Yet I number him in the song. He too has resigned his part. In the casual comedy, he too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Now, the second stanza is important because it elegizes people. It is written in memory of people who have died recently. Who are these people? They are rebels whom Yeats intimately knew. That woman refers to the nationalist politician Constance Gorbooth Markievicz. This man was the poet Patrick Pearse, a leader of the uprising. His helper and friend was the poet Thomas MacDonagh. The drunken, vainglorious lout was John McBride, Maud Gonne's abusive former husband. Maud Gonne was the person that Yeats remained quite infatuated by and wrote most of his poetry imagining her as his muse. These individuals, John McBride, Patrick Pearse, Constance Gorbooth Markievicz, they're not described heroically. In fact, it's a strange kind of elegy. If Yeats wants these people to be remembered with respect, he's saying some pretty bad things. He's criticizing them in very mild ways and sometimes not very mild ways. Yeats chastises Markievicz for her shrillness and describes McBride as loathsome. The two poets, he observed, might have been better off remaining educators and writers. But in the first stanza, Yeats recognized that each had resigned his part in the casual comedy of everyday life. So, the first thing to note is that Yeats produces a particular kind of pathos, a particular kind of pity, by writing about these people who had passed away, these rebels, these individuals who had given up their lives. And while doing that, while remembering these individuals, while remembering their sacrifice, while remembering the beliefs for which they give up their lives, Yeats also describes his own disagreement with them. Yeats does not hold back the objective criticism that he feels he must make, being the person that he is, having had the upbringing, the education, the psychological makeup that he had. A key phrase is drunken, vainglorious lout. It's a very powerful expression. It's musical. It's a very, very powerful poetic use of the language. It is an expression used for a person that Yeats wants his readers to remember with great respect. What kind of respect can a word or an expression like this create for a person who is sought to be remembered? That is the question that readers ask, and that is the question, that is the challenge that Yeats sets before himself. And further, Yeats explains why these people did what they did, and why, despite his disagreements, his misgivings, he still is writing a poem with a great deal of feeling. The next stanza goes thus: hearts with one purpose alone through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone to trouble the living stream. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range, from cloud to tumbling cloud, minute by minute they change. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. A horse hoof slides on the brim, a horse splashes within it. the long-legged moorhens dive, and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live, the stones in the midst of all. The image of the stone here is a contrast to the image of nature, which in typical classical elegies consoles the poet. In classical elegies, nature is cyclical. In this elegy, the stone does not change. The stone is fixed. The world changes. The stone gives an indication of how feelings and hearts, how people can remain indifferent, how people can remain cold, unchanging, and how the hardness and fixity of certain beliefs can produce a great deal of pain, emotional discomfort. The stanza continues, "Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part. Our part to murmur, name upon name, as a mother names her child when sleep at last has come, or limbs that run wild." And this is how the poem concludes. "I write it out in a verse, Macdona and McBride, and Connolly and Peirce. Now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born." This poem signifies not just a political consciousness, but it also signifies the poet's artistic development. The title, Easter 1916, gives us a view of the context in which Yeats decided to write this poem. Easter 1916 refers to a failed rebellion. A group of Irish nationalists mounted a challenge against the British government. They failed, and they were executed by firing squads. Yeats, who had earlier remained indifferent, felt deeply moved, felt shaken to his core. And it is that experience of being shaken which finds expression in this poem. Now, having understood all of this, having witnessed Yeats's treatment of the known dead, the reception that Auden produced, the kind of learning that Auden undertook from Yeats's writing, we are now well placed to appreciate and read Auden's poem in memory of W.B. Yeats. This is how the poem begins. "He disappeared in the dead of winter. The brooks were frozen, the airports almost deserted. Snow disfigured the public statues. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. What instruments we have agree, the day of his death was a dark, cold day." So, Auden modernizes the elegy. Dead of winter, this was actually historically inaccurate. Yeats did not die in the dead of winter. But dead of winter is an expression that Auden borrows from the classical elegy, in which nature is anthropomorphized. Nature is given a human form in order to signify the lack of life and the presence of death. Brooks were frozen, airports almost deserted. Airports gives a very, very modern view. Airports signifies how deep the poet and the readers are in the 20th century. And it is almost disconnected to the life of the person who is being remembered. The key message that Auden seeks to convey in this poem, in memory of W.B. Yeats, can be found in the second and third stanzas, and I will briefly read and unpack the meaning of these stanzas. The second section is very short and very powerful and key to help us. It is key for our understanding of what gives this poem its unique power. "You were silly like us, your gift survived it all. The parish of rich women, physical decay, yourself. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. Now Ireland has her madness, and her weather still, for poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its making, where executives would never want to tamper, flows on south from ranches of isolation and the busy griefs, raw towns that we believe and die in. It survives a way of happening, a mouth. This is key because uh, Auden finds a way to forgive Yeats. Auden needs a reason to forgive Yeats because Auden did not agree with many of Yeats's beliefs, and he certainly did not agree with most of Yeats's political beliefs. So Auden finds a way to forgive Yeats by humanizing Yeats. And the distinction that Auden makes is between the poet who writes the poem and the poet who emerges from the poem. The act of writing transforms the poet. The poet who wrote the poems, that is, the Yeats who held strange and obnoxious political beliefs many times, Auden admits was silly. Human beings are silly, and everyone has a right to make mistakes. The person who wrote poems as William Butler Yeats was silly, like everyone else. Your gift survived it all means that the poems that he produced transformed the poet himself. So the poet whose identity is recreated from the words is a different poet from the poet who held these conservative beliefs. So the poet, Auden distinguishes these two figures. The conservative Yeats is the Yeats who inhabited the parish of rich women, physical decay, yourself. Right? And then Auden writes that Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. So Mad Ireland is blamed for doing something harmful to the poet. Right? And Auden writes further, now Ireland has her madness and her weather still, for poetry makes nothing happen. Right? So the implication is that at some point, Yeats was inspired to write in order to produce a change that he desired to see in the Ireland that he inhabited. However, Yeats was smart enough and foresighted enough and enough of a poet to know that poetry makes nothing happen. This is a sentence that has a remarkably ironic meaning. On one hand, Auden is saying that, yes, poets don't have much respect because these are simply words. Auden writes that poetry survives in the valley of its making. So poetry fails to produce political or social change, but it does succeed in one particular way. It survives in the valley of its making, right, where executives would never want to tamper, flows on south from ranches of isolation to the busy griefs. Right? Now, what Auden is saying is that poetry produces an impact, makes a change in the emotional world in which we live. Further, in Auden's words, poetry survives as a way of happening, a mouth. The word mouth connects to an important poem by W.B. Yeats, in which Yeats also used the same word, a mouth, to convey the uniqueness and the strange kind of reality that a poet inhabits and that a poem creates. So we see how Auden's elegy for Yeats repeats many of the words that Yeats himself used, finds a way to forgive Yeats by reimagining Yeats's place and by using some of the words that Yeats himself used. That concludes our study and our discussion of the place of W.H. Auden in this canon of 20th century poetry. We will continue discussing other poets in the subsequent lectures. Thank you.